You haven't eaten in 2 days. You know exactly where the herd is. You tracked it yesterday, found the print line, mapped the route in your head. All you have to do now is get there. And then it starts raining. Not a light drizzle, a heavy, wind-driven rain that doesn't let up. It goes all day, then all night, then into the next morning, and it's still going. Now you can't hunt. You can't read tracks because the mud has washed them away. You can't move across open ground because wet rock and bare feet mean a twisted ankle. And out here, a twisted ankle means death. The river near your camp is rising. And the fire, the one thing keeping you warm, keeping predators off, keeping you alive, is starting to struggle under the damp. You're not bored, you're trapped. And every hour that passes without a decision made correctly brings you closer to a mistake you won't get to walk back. For most of human history, rain wasn't an inconvenience. It was a crisis, one that could stretch on for days, and what people did inside that crisis might matter more than anything they ever did on a clear one. Today, when it rains, you close a window, make coffee, maybe grab a blanket, and open something to watch. You sink into the couch and let the sounds lull you half asleep. For you, rain is background noise. But for someone 50,000 years ago, that exact same sound could kill them in 3 different ways before it even stopped. So here's the real question. What do you actually do when the sky refuses to clear for days at a time, with no roof, no waterproof anything, and nowhere else to go? Because the answer turns out to explain a stunning amount of what makes us human. Start with why rain was so dangerous in the first place. The first killer is cold. A wet body loses heat up to 25 times faster than a dry one. Without clothing, without a truly waterproof shelter, a long storm in anything below about 10 degrees Celsius could push a person's core temperature into hypothermia within hours. And this wasn't rare. Much of the world our ancestors lived in got that cold at night, even in parts of Africa during the wet season at higher elevation. Rain didn't need a blizzard behind it to be lethal. It just needed to keep falling. The threat wasn't limited to one climate either. In the high mountains of Ice Age Europe, a summer storm could drop temperatures fast enough to catch a hunting party completely unprepared, hours from any shelter. In tropical regions, monsoon downpours brought a different version of the same danger. Hour after hour of soaking rain that never gave the body a chance to dry out and recover, even when the air itself wasn't especially cold. Wherever you lived, rain found a way to turn a survivable temperature into a lethal one. And the danger didn't announce itself dramatically. It crept in quietly, a slow drop in awareness and coordination long before anyone realized how much heat they'd already lost, which is part of what made it so deceptively deadly compared to a threat you could actually see coming. The second killer is flooding. The caves and rock shelters people relied on most are often built at the base of hillsides or near rivers, which is exactly where flash floods go. Archaeologists have found layers of flood sediment inside caves that were clearly occupied at the time, meaning water rushed in while people were living there. Some of those sediment layers are thick, and in several cases, the evidence shows the cave was never used again afterward. Flooding didn't just ruin a shelter for a season. It could take a home away permanently. And permanent loss meant something specific for a group with no written maps and no easy way to simply look up an alternative. It meant walking back out into unfamiliar, exposed terrain during exactly the kind of weather when unfamiliar terrain was most dangerous to cross, searching for a new place to survive the rest of the same storm that had just taken the old one away. The third killer, maybe the worst, is predators. Rain drives animals into shelter too, and sometimes that shelter was the exact same cave a family was already living in. There are cave sites in South Africa where human remains and large cat remains turn up in the same sediment layers. Some of those human remains have puncture marks in the skull that match a leopard's canine teeth almost perfectly. Rain didn't just make life uncomfortable, it compressed the entire ecosystem. Humans, predators, and prey all forced into the same small dry pockets of space at the same time. And in the middle of all that, one single job mattered more than everything else combined: keeping the fire alive. Here's why that was so genuinely terrifying. Before roughly 40,000 years ago, researchers aren't even fully certain how reliably humans could start a fire completely from scratch. There's solid evidence of controlled fire use going back at least 400,000 years at a site called Blombos Cave in Israel, and possibly as far back as 1,000,000 years at Blombos Cave in South Africa. But controlling a fire that already exists and creating a brand new one from nothing are two very different skills. And for most of human history, a large share of people probably couldn't reliably do the second one. So if a fire went out, you might not be able to relight it at all. You'd have to carry an ember from somewhere else, and some groups genuinely did exactly that. They transported smoldering coals wrapped in damp green leaves, or packed inside a tough, woody fungus called tinder fungus, which could catch a spark and smolder quietly inside itself for hours. It functioned as a biological lighter, something you kept alive and carried between camps. We know this wasn't guesswork, because when researchers found Ötzi the Iceman, the roughly 5,300-year-old body preserved in the Alps, he was carrying a complete fire-starting kit in his belt pouch. Tinder fungus, flint, a lump of iron pyrite for striking sparks, and extra dried plant material as backup tinder. Even 5,000 years ago, losing your fire was serious enough that people carried dedicated equipment specifically to prevent it. So when rain hit, the very first priority wasn't shelter, it was the fire. Move it deeper into the cave, away from the wind and the drip line. Shield it with hides or brush stacked against the weather. Feed it carefully, not too much fuel at once, not too little either. Search out dead lower branches from conifer trees, the ones still shielded by the canopy above, since those often stayed dry underneath even in a downpour. Split open soaked logs to reach the dry wood hidden at the core. Use birch bark as kindling, because birch contains a compound called betulin that actually burns even when it's wet. One person's entire job during a multi-day storm might genuinely have been just sitting beside that fire for hours on end, feeding it, shielding it, making absolutely sure it didn't die, because that fire was everything. It was warmth, it was light, it was safety from the things circling outside. It was cooked food, and it was the literal center of every social interaction the group had. Letting it go out wasn't careless. It was potentially fatal for the entire group at once. Groups that kept multiple people rotating through fire duty, rather than relying on a single exhausted person, almost certainly fared better across a long storm, simply because a tired, cold person makes worse decisions exactly when the fire needs the most careful attention. There's a threat almost nobody talks about that goes hand in hand with all that standing water: disease. Rain doesn't just fall and drain away cleanly, it pools. Stagnant puddles form near camps, contaminated by waste, by dead insects, by whatever the runoff carries with it. And drinking from the wrong pool could mean days of illness at exactly the moment a group could least afford to be weak. Ancient people clearly figured out how to tell the difference, because certain water sources near known campsites show signs of repeated, long-term use across thousands of years, while others, sitting just as close, were apparently avoided entirely. Some groups went further than just avoiding bad water. Natural rock depressions that fill with clean rainwater turn up near a striking number of prehistoric campsites, and in several cases, those hollows show clear signs of being deliberately carved a little deeper, on purpose, to hold more water for longer. That's not an accident of geology. That's early infrastructure, a natural cistern improved by hand, built specifically to make the aftermath of a storm survivable instead of dangerous. Some groups appear to have returned to the same improved hollow year after year, generation after generation, which suggests this wasn't a one-time discovery, but a piece of practical knowledge deliberately passed down alongside everything else that mattered. Now picture the scene once the fire is holding and the worst of the danger outside is being managed. You're mostly dry. You cannot leave. So what do you actually do with all that forced, unbroken time? You make things. The archaeological record is remarkably clear on this. Caves and rock shelters are absolutely packed with evidence of manufacturing. Stone tools in every single stage of production, from raw, unworked stone to finished, sharpened points. Piles of flaking debris, those tiny chips of rock that fly off when someone is carefully shaping a tool, found concentrated in specific spots inside caves, exactly where a person would sit near the firelight and work for hours without interruption. But it wasn't only stone. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists uncovered a full 100,000-year-old ochre processing workshop. Abalone shells used as mixing containers. Ochre ground carefully into fine powder. Bone tools used specifically to stir and apply the finished pigment. This wasn't basic survival behavior. This was production, a repeatable process someone had clearly worked out in advance. Someone sat in that cave, quite possibly while rain pounded down outside, and manufactured pigment on purpose, following a system. Ochre wasn't just decoration either. It shows up in contexts suggesting it may have served as an early form of hide preservative, an insect deterrent, even sun protection. Meaning that workshop may have been solving several practical problems at once, not just producing something ornamental. Then there are bone needles. They start appearing in the archaeological record around 61,000 years ago in South Africa, and later spread across Europe and Asia. These are delicate, precise tools with tiny drilled eyes, genuinely difficult to make correctly. You don't sit down and make a bone needle while running from something. You make one when you're sitting still, focused, with real hours to spare. Rainy days handed people exactly that kind of time, over and over again. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. At a Neanderthal site called Abri du Marat in France, archaeologists found a tiny fragment of twisted plant fiber string dated to roughly 50,000 years ago. It's the oldest direct physical evidence of string ever recovered. And at Hohlefeld's cave in Germany, researchers discovered a 35,000-year-old tool carved from mammoth ivory, fitted with 4 separate holes and spiral grooves, designed specifically for twisting raw plant fiber into rope. Someone sat in that cave and carved an entire dedicated rope-making device. Making rope by hand is slow, repetitive, and demands patience most days simply don't allow for. It's close to the perfect bad weather task. And rope changed everything downstream of it. It let you tie things together, build sturdier shelters, construct snares and traps, bind stone tool heads onto wooden handles. An enormous share of everyday human technology, even now, quietly depends on some version of string or rope, and it was almost certainly first perfected by someone stuck indoors, waiting out a storm with nothing else to do. The discovery at Abri du Marat matters for another reason too. It came from a Neanderthal site, not a modern human one, which means this particular piece of patient, weather-driven ingenuity wasn't unique to our own species. Whoever we shared the landscape with was doing the exact same thing during their own long, wet, idle hours. And it wasn't just tools and cordage. People were also making their shelters genuinely livable. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found something most people wouldn't expect from 77,000 years ago: bedding. Actual constructed bedding. Layers of sedges, rushes, and grasses carefully arranged into proper sleeping mats. The uppermost layer included leaves from a plant called Cape laurel, which happens to work as a natural insect repellent. Someone in that cave wasn't just surviving. They were making the space comfortable. They were making it feel like home. And the bedding itself was periodically burned and replaced entirely to keep it clean. 77,000 years ago, people were already practicing basic pest control. Staying dry mattered just as much as staying warm, and that meant clothing had to do more than simply cover the body. Treating hide with rendered animal fat made it noticeably more water-resistant, and evidence suggests some groups kept a separate, heavier layer specifically for wet weather, distinct from what they wore day to day. That's a genuinely modern idea. A dedicated rain layer, treated and maintained differently from the rest of your wardrobe, built and repaired specifically because ordinary clothing simply wasn't enough once a storm set in. Maintaining that treated layer was itself another rainy day task, since the fat coating wore off with use and needed reapplying by hand, worked carefully into the hide strand by strand until it was ready to shed water again. Then the story takes a turn almost nobody expects. Because everything so far, the tools, the rope, the bedding, the treated clothing, that's the practical side. What came next is something else entirely. Art. Chauvet Cave in southern France contains paintings roughly 36,000 years old. Lions, horses, rhinos, bears, rendered with a level of skill and observation that genuinely stuns people today. The artist clearly understood anatomy, movement, perspective. Several of the animals are drawn mid-stride, muscles visibly tensed, heads turning as if caught in motion. These aren't idle scratches. They're the work of people who had watched these animals for thousands of cumulative hours and then recreated them from memory alone, deep underground, entirely by firelight. And Chauvet isn't unique. Lascaux, Altamira, and the caves of Sulawesi in Indonesia, where cave art has been dated to at least 45,000 years old, making it the oldest known figurative art anywhere on Earth. But here's what makes this genuinely striking. These paintings aren't near the entrance, where you'd naturally sit for shelter from weather. They're deep, sometimes hundreds of meters in, through narrow passages, in chambers you'd have to crawl on your hands and knees to even reach. Someone carried a small animal fat lamp into total, absolute darkness and painted. Think about that for a second. Nobody does that when the weather is perfect and the hunting is good. You do that when you genuinely cannot go outside, when the rain has been falling for 2 straight days, when every tool you own has already been sharpened and there's nothing left to do but go deeper into the dark and make something. We can't prove outright that cave art was specifically a rainy day activity, but the logic holds together uncomfortably well. The most striking creative explosion in all of human prehistory happened in precisely the places where people were most likely to be stuck indoors for extended stretches at a time. Carrying a small stone lamp fueled by animal fat down a narrow, flooded passage wasn't a casual decision either. It took planning, spare fuel, and someone willing to sit alone in absolute silence for hours. Which sounds a great deal like exactly the kind of unhurried, forced patience a long storm hands you, whether you want it or not. And that leads somewhere even bigger. Rain may not have only created art, it may have helped create human culture itself. Think about the mechanics of it. What actually happens when 15 to 30 people are forced into a confined space together for days on end, with genuinely nothing else to do? You talk. You listen. You share whatever you know. In 2014, anthropologist Polly Wiesner published a study comparing daytime conversation against nighttime fireside conversation among the Jew/Hawansi in the Kalahari Desert. During the day, people talked almost entirely about practical matters, land use, resources, small complaints. But at night, around the fire, over 80% of the conversation shifted toward stories, songs, and shared ritual. The firelight itself seemed to change what people were willing to talk about. It softened faces, lowered tension, opened a space where people let their guard down. The campfire wasn't just a source of warmth, it functioned as humanity's original social network. And what got shared around that fire wasn't idle chatter. It was survival information passed as pure story. Where water sources dry up first in summer, which plants are genuinely safe to eat, where the best flint deposits sit, how to track one specific difficult animal. That's not gossip. That's critical life or death knowledge moving from one mind into another purely through speech. Beyond the practical layer, there was something else too. Myth. Stories explaining where rain comes from, why it falls, where it goes when it stops. Nearly every ancient culture on Earth developed some form of rain mythology, and somebody, somewhere, originally invented each of those stories. They almost certainly did it while sitting in the exact same situation the story itself was trying to explain. There's something almost circular about it. The storm gave people the stillness required to invent an explanation for the storm itself. And then that same explanation got carried forward by people sitting through the next one. Here's a detail that shows just how powerful this kind of storytelling actually was. The oldest known oral traditions ever verified against real, independent geological evidence are Australian Aboriginal stories describing sea level changes that happened roughly 7,000 years ago. Those specific stories survived 7,000 years through nothing but people telling them to each other, generation after generation, with zero writing involved. That kind of cultural memory doesn't develop by accident. It requires groups spending enormous, repeated stretches of time doing exactly one thing: sitting together, retelling the same stories again and again until they became permanent. Passing knowledge down wasn't limited to stories either. Long stretches of forced downtime were also when the most patient, hands-on teaching happened. An elder guiding a child's hands through the exact motion of striking stone correctly, over and over, correcting the angle each time, wasn't a lesson that fit neatly into a normal working day full of hunting and gathering. It needed unhurried time nobody was otherwise using. Rain created exactly that kind of space, hour after hour, with nowhere else for anyone to be. So rainy days weren't dead time being wasted. They were transmission time. The specific stretches when knowledge moved deliberately from the old to the young. When skills got taught properly through demonstration rather than rushed instruction. When the whole group's collective memory got reinforced and quietly updated. A single long storm might have taught a child more about how to actually make things than an entire ordinary month of clear weather ever could. Simply because clear weather always came with somewhere more urgent to be. Now here's a part almost nobody talks about. Rain wasn't always purely bad. Sometimes it was genuinely the best thing that could happen. After a heavy rain, the ground turns soft. And soft ground means perfect tracks. Deep, clear, highly detailed. You can see exactly which animals passed through, roughly how long ago, how fast they were moving, and which direction they went. Some of the very best tracking conditions anywhere in the world show up right after rain finally stops. Rain also meant water, plainly and simply. People could collect and store rainwater directly, and even earlier hominins may well have understood this. Natural rock depressions that fill with clean water during a storm turn up near almost every known prehistoric campsite on record. But water wasn't the only thing rain brought with it. Mushrooms and certain plants genuinely explode in growth right after rainfall. Tubers come up far easier out of softened, wet soil. Insects surface in huge numbers. A rainy stretch didn't shut down the food supply at all. It transformed it completely. And the groups who understood exactly how it changed held a real, measurable advantage over the groups who didn't. Termites are a perfect example. They swarm heavily after rain across tropical Africa, and they happen to be one of the most protein-dense foods available anywhere nearby. You don't need tools, you don't need weapons. You just reach down and pick them up by the handful. There are chimpanzees alive right now that gorge themselves on termite swarms after a rainstorm, and early humans almost certainly did the exact same thing, very likely on a far larger, more organized scale. Fish behaved differently after rain too, since rising, churned water pushed them into shallower, easier-to-reach stretches of river, turning what was normally a difficult, uncertain catch into something considerably closer to a sure thing for anyone willing to wade in right after the worst of a storm passed. Even where a group chose to camp reflected all of this thinking. Sites positioned slightly above a floodplain, close enough to reach fresh water and rich post-rain foraging, but high enough to avoid the worst of a flash flood, show up again and again across the archaeological record. That's not luck. That's generations of accumulated knowledge about exactly how water behaves, quietly built directly into where people chose to live. So what did ancient humans actually do when it rained for days on end? Everything that mattered. They kept the fire alive, feeding it by hand for hours at a stretch. They shaped the tools they'd need for the very next hunt. They sewed and treated the clothing that would carry them safely through the coming winter. They twisted the rope that would hold their shelters together against the next storm. They ground the pigment they'd later carry deep underground to paint animals onto cave walls by lamplight. They told the stories that would carry survival knowledge intact across generations who would never meet each other. And when the rain finally stopped, they walked back out onto soft ground, covered edge to edge in perfect, readable animal tracks, and got straight back to work. Rain didn't slow them down, Not really. It gave them the forced, unbroken time to prepare for absolutely everything that came next. Every tool, every stitch of treated clothing, every twisted length of rope, every story, every painted animal deep inside a dark cave. All of
The
it
hunter knew he had to
traces
get back before the
to
sunset,
downtime,
but the river
to
was
the
rising
hours
too
and days
fast to
when
cross.
people simply couldn't go outside and had nothing left to do except sit close to a fire and think. And notice something about that list. It isn't a random pile of unrelated inventions. Fire management fed directly into tool making, since you needed steady light and warmth to work by. Tool making fed directly into rope making, since better blades meant faster, cleaner cordage. Rope fed into better shelters and better clothing. Better shelters and clothing meant people could sit still comfortably for longer, which meant more time for pigment, for painting, for stories. Every single rainy day skill quietly built the foundation the next one needed, storm after storm, generation after generation, until an entire technological and cultural system had assembled itself almost by accident, one miserable, trapped afternoon at a time. Boredom didn't really exist for them the way it exists for you. Because when you're sitting in a cave with rain hammering steadily outside, and your survival genuinely depends on what you manage to make with your own hands in the next few hours, you don't get bored. You get resourceful. You get creative out of pure necessity. And that might be one of the single biggest reasons we're still here at all. Every rainstorm your ancestors sat through wasn't lost time. It was the raw material for nearly everything that eventually made us who we are. Our tools, our clothing, our art, our stories, our whole capacity to sit with other people and build something out of nothing but patience and shared attention. So next time it rains and you reach for your phone out of boredom within about 90 seconds, think about that for a moment. Somewhere in your ancestry, someone sat through exactly that same sound for 2 straight days. And by the time it stopped, they'd invented something the rest of us are still quietly relying on. So, would you have made it through one of those storms? Tell me honestly in the comments. If stories like this genuinely interest you, hit like. It helps the channel more than you'd probably think. And subscribe if you want more of how people turned the worst weather on the planet into the raw material for almost everything we now call civilization.